Welcome to Purpose 360. I'm Carol Cohn, and today more than ever before, companies, brands, and their partners need to stand for something beyond the bottom line. I've created this program to provide insights and ideas to share with you so that you can apply them to your work the very next day. The goal here is to up-level your purpose and to benefit companies and society. So please join us. Today's episode is one you absolutely have to listen to. Judy Samuelson, who is an old friend, and she is the founder and executive director of the Aspen Institute Business and Society program. And she's also a vice president at the Institute. Judy has just written a book called The 6 New Rules of Business, Creating Real Value in a Changing World. Because Judy's background has been everything from business and banking and major foundations and think tanks, she brings this unique vision to the role that business must evolve to in our rapidly changing world. And she codifies her point of view in these 6 rules that are just extraordinary. I trust that after our conversation today, that you are going to want to go out and buy these books, not just for you, but your team. Because she truly, clearly, and in an inspiring and compelling way, draws us in to why the business world must adapt. Let's begin. So welcome to the show, Judy.
Thank you, Carol. Wow, what a welcome.
Now, I'm going to embarrass you some more because that's what I always do when I bring on these incredible thought leaders. So this comes from background on the 6 new rules of business. The rules of business are changing dramatically. Success is no longer defined by the balance sheet. Reputation, trust, and other intangibles drive business value, give employees voice to the risk in the company, as well as what their needs are, competitive advantage, and I love this, culture is king. Business as usual, says Judy. It's not a viable option anymore. From technology to supply chains, social impact to environmental limits, the landscape for business and the definition of success has been upended. Income inequality is rife. Social discord is high, and the demand for business to create real value for all its stakeholders has become a loud and rallying cry. Many of the forces that define these new rules of business are already in play, and business, arguably the most powerful force in the world, is in a desperate need of a new operating manual. So let's get into background on this book, because I know once you listen to this, my listeners, you are going to want to buy many copies. So Judy, I want to start with the basics. Can you tell us about the Aspen Institute and what is your role in it?
The Aspen Institute is a wonderful organization. It has a platform for many programs, most of which focus on institutional change. They blend dialogue, bringing people together from different perspectives who are leaning into a problem and are looking for better solutions and a better way to move forward. And they engage in identifying, supporting leaders, change agents working inside critical institutions. In our case, in the Business and Society program at the Aspen Institute, it's all about aligning business decision-making with the long-term health of society.
And that is profound. And I have attended a couple of your events, and I came away with just my mind bursting with new ideas. And so the Aspen Institute, which was founded in 1949, is just going incredibly strong and moving forward. And it's so in tune with how business needs to evolve today. So let's just talk a little bit about you. Why do you do the work that you do?
I wonder about that sometimes. I think, I've worked in all sectors. After college, I worked in the state capitol in California for a number of years. I came east for business school. I worked in banking, a street banker in the Garment Center of New York City. I moved to the Ford Foundation, where I took over the program-related investment program there, which today we would call impact investing or something along those lines, a program really dedicated to supporting intermediaries between private markets and public good, and supported that financially through investment vehicles. And then at Ford, I began to think more about the role of corporations and created this program. So I do think that one of the things that enables me to do what I do is I'm drawn towards systemic change. That is, for some reason, that's at the root of what I care the most about, and which really animates my work, our work. And I think for some reason, because of maybe spending so much time in different sectors, I do have an ability to look at things from different perspectives. And I think, to a great extent, business is a remarkably important institution, but it's in a squeeze play. And to understand what moves us forward, I think you have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of other kinds of institutions and interests. And, that's part of the magic, I believe.
I believe it too. So let's get into the book. Writing a book, as you know, it's just painful and it's arduous. And, every word, you're just like, is it the right word? And is this the right point? So what was the impetus to write the book?
Well, I wanted to tell our story. I founded the Business and Society program on January 1st, 1998. We've been at this for a long period of time. And I've learned a lot, both in the period of time when I was at the Ford Foundation, and then since then, I've learned a lot about what really drives business decision-making, kind of what's going on in the DNA. And I wanted to talk about what I think is kind of the underbelly of this system, as opposed to the kind of CSR view of business, which I think a lot of which is seen from the outside, but doesn't get at some of the fundamental conflicts that exist between the incentive systems and the kind of decision rules and protocols and the things that leaders are held to account for by an important segment of the investor market versus the aspirations and the license to operate on the other hand. And this complex story is one that I think we need to better understand.
And you cut it into segments to make it very understandable. So let's go into the 6 new rules of business. Can you briefly share them? And then I want to go into some of them more deeply.
I think a fundamental one today, when I got out of business school, we were measuring the value of firms in terms of kind of bricks and mortar hard assets and discounting cash flows, 30 years out and applying a discount rate. All of that stuff today doesn't really line up against the reality that something like 85% of business valuation is based on intangibles. In other words, things that we can't necessarily measure very easily. Trust is a big one. Trust in institutions is down everywhere, but clearly trust in business is down. The license to operate, the sense that you want to be able to land wherever you want and operate business the way you want to be able to do it. Well, your reputation precedes you, and your ability to negotiate that space, your ability to attract and retain talent. All of these things make up business valuation today. And what you mentioned earlier, culture is an important piece of this. So that's an important piece, which takes us right to something, Carol, that you have written eloquently about and focused on for many years, which is, what is the purpose of the corporation? Today, businesses, it's very clear, they serve many purposes. It's certainly not about shareholder primacy, although a lot of that legacy is in place. The third piece is just how much the definition of the responsibilities of business have shifted. They land way outside the gate. Companies with global reach and attenuated supply chains, they're not defining what the responsibilities are. They're being defined by agents that want to hijack your brand for purposes of making a larger point and a bigger play in a system at risk. And that happens time and again. And, oftentimes the responsibilities that are defined are not things that you even believe within the business or within your control. So it's complicated terrain. Fourth, and this is something I think we're all seeing, is the degree to which our notion of what employees are about has shifted. Mm-hmm. The old rule was that employees are a cost of doing business. Today, it is increasingly clear that employees are the accountability mechanism for business. I call it accountability from the cafeteria. Were we still in the cafeteria? Maybe we'll get back to that place at some point. But employees are really your ally. They're well aligned with the long-term health of the enterprise and open up both risk and opportunity to better view. A couple that are kind of maybe even more surprising, it used to be that capital is king. Financial capital isn't that critical anymore. We're awash in capital. It's not a scarce resource. And the stock market is a lot of noise, but it's not necessarily representing the current interest of the corporation. Culture is much more important. It's culture that's king, not capital today. And then finally, something we're seeing in real time is that when the system is at risk, we need to co-create, not just compete.
No, you and I are so aligned on so many of these rules. I for sure you wrote about them more eloquently than I state them, but love them all. So we don't have enough time today to go into all of them, but I do want to hopscotch into some of the ones that truly I think our listeners will want to go deeper on. So let's go to chapter 2, which is about purpose. You've been in this field for a long time. Why is purpose really important today? Can you give us one or two examples of companies that are really doing it right?
Purpose is ground zero. It's the organizing principle for activity. It's the reason employees get up in the morning and want to go to work. It is central to kind of setting the company's direction, and it's fully within the control of the executive. I write about a faculty member, Karen Brenner, who teaches, does work between the business school and the law school at NYU. And she gives her students an assignment in her class to, kind of take out a business, to create a business,
Okay.
So you call up the Secretary of State and you get the form and download it and pay $75, and you're asked to say, what is the purpose of the enterprise? The executive decides. It's not something that's foisted on you by law. So, but it's clearly it's the opportunity to, as Larry Fink would say, find the touchstone that belongs in the public sphere here. How do you align purpose with something bigger than you are is part of the quest. I think some of the companies that do this well have always done this well. I write about Levi Strauss. It's a company I have great admiration for. They've been around for something like 175 years. They were started during the gold rush. That's a company that still lives by the culture of the family, the values of the family that have woven through the history of Levi Strauss. And you can see in their actions the degree to which they're ahead of the curve because they're thoughtful about who they are as an enterprise, who they're trying to serve, what constitutes a quality product, and are continuing, it's the notion of continuous improvement here. They're always shifting the norms around product development to make sure that they are kind of current with the latest concerns and definitions of quality product.
For example, and I went to one of your courses at Levi's. You held it there in San Francisco. And their waterless jeans are a great example of, they knew that water was an issue, 42 liters of water made a pair of jeans, and they totally reconstituted their manufacturing processes, from the machines they use to going all the way downstream to helping cotton farmers be more effective, and also to the way that end of life use cutting jeans into insulation. So I totally agree with you.
The other thing I'd say about Levi's, if I might, is that they don't stop at the gates of their own enterprise.
Exactly.
The impact they have influences the entire industry. So they were the first to really disclose their factories as a way of being fully transparent and holding themselves out to public accountability to make sure that they were always ahead of over the bar of what is considered an appropriate standard. And of course, it was Michael Kabori at Levi Strauss was instrumental in creating the Better Cotton Initiative.
Oh, great guy. Yeah, truly wonderful. I also love that you have this quote in your book from Jeff Weiner from LinkedIn, defining authenticity. And he says, simply, it's about keeping your promises. It's about actions, not words. So I love that. Let's take a break and find out what else is happening besides this podcast that you may want to know about. In our In the Know section this week, the question rises, did stakeholder capitalism get the pink slip? What happened was very disappointing. One of our great leaders in the field of stakeholder capitalism, Emmanuel Faber, one of the world's foremost proponents, lost his job as CEO and chairman of Danone. It would be easy to say that this is a blow for stakeholder capitalism moving forward. But perhaps, according to Just Capital, that would be a mistake. Faber, for background, invested heavily in sustainable products and packaging and acquired France's legal qualification of a purpose-driven company and B Corp status for Danone North America. Ultimately, however, it appears that activist investors pushed Faber out, not because he was so committed to sustainability, but because he wasn't delivering returns. For the past couple years, Danone's share price has underperformed both Unilever and Nestle, two companies that, is important to note, have also embraced bold ESG initiatives. Engine number one's battle with ExxonMobil is an interesting parallel, except here the activist is pushing for stronger climate-related investments. What both cases have in common is that they are ultimately about the pathway to greater shareholder returns. Where they differ is on the means to get there. This focus on long-term value generation is fundamental because it knits together everything. Take diversity, equity, and inclusion, for example. Former Xerox CEO Ursula Burns, speaking on CNBC recently, frames her championing of gender and race, ethnicity, and equity within companies in terms of performance and as a way to attract and retain top talent and better serve customers. So what is the difference between Emmanuel Faber and Danone and Ursula Burns or ExxonMobil? As Just Capital reminds us, corporate commitments to ESG and stakeholder performance must at some point translate into both strong financial performance and real outcomes on the underlying societal issues at stake. Remember, it's the power of and. That is the point. And Just Capital, in its continuing polling with business leaders, say that this is where we all need to work really hard between business impact and social impact, and the power of the two aligning together to support growth as well as impact. Now back to our conversation with Judy Samuelson. let's go to another area that I found intriguing. You talk about the need to define stakeholders more precisely for companies. Can you explain what you're thinking there?
I don't love the term stakeholder. My colleagues in the Business Society program give me a lot of grief about this because it's like, hey, look, can we go with what's current here? And of course, it is a powerful idea, but only in opposition to the idea that it's about shareholders. It's that kind of stakeholders versus shareholders that animates the conversation. You and I have both been at this table for a long period of time. Stakeholder capitalism is not a new idea. It's one that's come back in vogue, but it doesn't help business make decisions, is my belief. Every company is different. Every industry is different. The kind of what needs to be true to assure that you are on the right path. What piece is absolutely critical as an input to the health of your enterprise is different for Intel than it is for McDonald's. And, the definition of that tends to get kind of a little mushy when we just talk about stakeholders. So I prefer to name them. I prefer to name what is absolutely critical to your enterprise to make sure that at the level of board and executive that we're managing to that input.
So I'm going to totally jump off my questions here, but you just mentioned board. And I would love, because you work with a lot of boards and board members, how are boards feeling today about the huge wave of purpose? And how does a practitioner, somebody, let's say in the C-suite, CCO, CMO, chief CSO, how do they work with a board to get the understanding and permission to embed more of society in an authentic way into their businesses?
Well, we could talk about CEO pay because that's at the center of this question, and it's one of the most significant responsibilities, if not the most significant responsibility of the board. But I want to just say, Carol, watch this space because I think we're going to see such massive change in boards in the next decade. When we get out of COVID, somebody who was a director was advising us on the work that we've done on CEO pay, and she said, we're going to get off of these Zoom calls, and a lot of us are going to say, enough. I helped you get through this meltdown, but it's time for me to move on, and I've been on enough Zoom to last me a lifetime. We also know that there's real and current pressure to diversify boards, gender, race, and that's underway and it's happening much more quickly. So I think we're going to see a very different kind of conversation because we're going to be bringing in younger people. We're going to be bringing in people who have a different life experience and a different point of view. It has been my own personal experience that women kind of over-select on the concern of business and how it relates to the wider kind of health of the society on which it's dependent. And so I think we'll see more change in that, but we're also starting to see boards experiment with different kinds of committee formation, and hopefully that's also being driven down into the firm as we talk about how that translates into how managers are actually rewarded and what needs to be true in order to make sure that we operationalize this change.
So the wind is going from being in your face to at your back when these boards start changing.
Yeah, I think that's true. It has been. They've been kind of running against it, and now are they going to? Can they take some confidence
yes.
from the way that the winds are shifting?
Absolutely. So thank you for that. I want to go to rule number 3, and it's about corporate responsibility. And it says, I just actually took a copy of this page. The old rule, corporate responsibility is defined by host communities and fence line neighbors. And probably most listening to this call are going to go, yeah, that's the way it is, but that's not good enough anymore. And you talk about the new rule, that that corporate responsibility is defined for outside the business gates. Can you talk about who's outside, what's outside, and why that's important?
You name any environmental organization today, labor organizations, they all have strategies and increasingly sophisticated ideas about how to work with the business sector. So you take organizations like World Wildlife Fund or Nature Conservancy, or one of my favorite ones is the Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, which I write about in the work of Jim Cannon, who works as kind of in a shadow space, but acknowledges the importance of the Oxfam or the Greenpeace, who creates the noise with a kind of media-facing strategy, but then motivates the company. The one that has the biggest brand, therefore, is the one who has the most at risk, but also the most to gain if we can figure this out. And it's about building the kind of coalitions within that enable massive change to take place. So in a lot of these kind of systems that business is wholly a part of, they may control a particular relationship, but they certainly don't control the entire supply chain. But when you're the one, say it's a McDonald's or a PepsiCo or a Walmart, if you're the one targeted and we're tarnishing your brand in order to, elevate the condition of a critical ecosystem or a labor condition or the health of a community of one kind or another, you're motivated to get at the table and to maybe over time start to get ahead of the curve when you see these questions and these risks emerging. So complex partnerships, attenuated supply chain, the need to work with and across your ecosystem as a business and sit with those who represent the interest of others that need to be considered in making good quality decisions.
You just gave like 4 great insights. So that was wonderful. Do you remember the time, and I do, when they had the orangutans that weren't real, that they were like people in orangutan suits, and they were climbing up the Unilever gates, their walls. And that was a pre-Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. That was, I think, pre-Paul Pullman. And to your point, was that Greenpeace, World Wildlife?
It's usually Greenpeace. I don't know if it was in that case. There was something similar done to McDonald's that first started the question around styrofoam. Remember styrofoam?
Right. Yeah.
And eliminating the clamshell packaging and all of that. Shell went through, many rounds of direct action. From Greenpeace and others. The thing that's interesting about this, Carol, and you probably know this, and I assume agree with this, it's the big brand is not usually the biggest problem. It's what sits behind that brand, the nameless B2B players on which the entire system is dependent, that may be the real targets of, hoisting a flag at the launch that Shell has raised its banner on.
Well, that's interesting. I don't know if you know this, but we conducted, we believe, the most comprehensive B2B purpose research, and we launched it right before, like the week before the shutdown, and found, interestingly, that B2B's 86% had a stated purpose. We were shocked. And it was everything from manufacturing to healthcare, professional services, financial services, and such. Yet, only 24% had it activated. So that's what we call that research, the B2B purpose paradox. So I think that there is some wins, gaining in B2B leaders. And so, but it is, to your point, it's the value chain. It's the supply chain that has to truly get in step with being much more accountable and responsible. So you and I are always in fierce agreement. You've got so many gems in this book. You've got like over 100 gems. You also advocate for cross-functional relationships in the organization to bring purpose into authentic action. And you suggest that strategists should interact with business leads to connect purpose, strategy, and capital allocation. Why?
Well, these strategists that we're talking about is, and you and I both know a lot of them. These are people that have deep experience in, engaging with, campaigners, targeted investors. I mean, a host of people that have a point of view and criticism of the company. They also sit inside the company and help advise investor relations and, on occasion, they're also advising the CEO. But these people are often, they're viewed too much as, that's CSR and that's the stuff we do down the hallway or when we have extra time and money. And increasingly, they will need to be at the center of the conversation in order to really think about strategy in terms of the long-term play and where all of these competing interests, and they are competing interests, they are not all working in an aligned way, and there are real trade-offs in line. There is no, you ask about profit and purpose, and how do they fit with one another? Of course you need both profits and you need purpose, but you can't have profit maximization and purpose. And these are healthy, kind of interlocutors who can help the company be more strategic and assuring that their intentions are met through their operations.
Wisely stated. Do you have any other suggestions how to arm the strategists or evolve, put some wind, like, move them over like a sailboat, towards the business units?
Well, I think today, a lot of it is happening, whether or not the company wants it to, is in fact a function of employee voice. You match the generations that have moved into it. And I think even for us boomers, I think it's not that wasn't always something that we would have liked, but we lived in a different era when there was more of an inclination to divide work and home. And of course, we didn't use social media, and that's changed everything. So I think some of it today is being attuned to what they're hearing from employees, but also inviting the outside in. And these corporate responsibility and sustainability strategists are uniquely equipped to do that with real authenticity, because they can speak to both the business model and the context in which that business operates.
I want to talk about rule number 5, because you talked about it in your introduction, and you said culture is king, and I'm going, yay! So I'd love you to just expand upon that, and then my part 2 of it, can you give some examples, but who are your favorites that just have these cultures that are so smart, defined, purposeful, human? So why is culture king versus cash is king?
Well, cash was king when cash was a scarce resource. When General Motors was at the top of the tables for, market valuation, it was a different ballgame. They were in constant raising capital mode because they were building plants and facilities, and expansion was a costly investment. But today, for tech companies, it's just not the case. I mean, we have tech companies going public all the time that aren't really accessing capital markets. They're just, listing with the market in order to enable their early investors, the venture capitalists and the like, to have an exit if they wish. And so that's changed dramatically. So the question is, there's 2 questions embedded there. Why do we cede so much ground to investors? Given that you got your money at the IPO, to quote Marjorie Kelly, the author of The Divine Right of Capital, you got your money at the IPO, and typically speaking, companies don't return to the public market. So why do they care? They care because sometimes their CEO, the CEO is always being paid to care by loading up the CEO with stock. But what's absolutely abundantly clear today is that the companies that really succeed are the ones that have a robust culture. So I write about Southwest Airlines. People talk all the time about Costco is another one. One of the ones that I write about in the book is Herman Miller. I mean, this is a company that's been around for a long time. And culture has always been a part, of the DNA of the company, in the sense that they put design at the center almost from the time that they flipped from being a small retail store to started going into the real furniture manufacturing business. So by putting design at the center, that puts the designer at the center. And they always valued that particularly important input that melded art and design and then morphs into quality. So what that enabled Herman Miller to do by building that kind of culture that valued design and the designer and the input of their employees was really allowed them to be ahead of the curve and to kind of get on the sustainability wave before it was really, current in many companies. And they built sustainability design into what it makes, what constitutes a high quality product. So that kind of thing is what's enabled by a robust culture, is staying ahead of the curve, innovation, deep listening of customers and customer service, and treating your employees well. So that becomes a natural outgrowth of a healthy relationship within your enterprise.
I would love your opinion on Microsoft, because we worked with them during the Bill Gates years, helped setting their purpose. and then later worked with Brad Smith. But now Satya Nadella is the leader there, and he's very, very different. And he's very humble. I've interviewed a couple people about Microsoft. Akhtar Badshah, who I think you know Akhtar, he's just great. And in his book, he says that, they went from being know-it-alls to learn-it-alls. So I don't know if you had an experience with Microsoft, but I found that they just have profoundly changed.
Yeah, I think they have changed. And of course, the company really did a turnaround in many respects too. And the stock prices followed. When Satya Nadella and Brad and the sustainability team announced these climate objectives last January 2020, that was a real...
that was a big deal.
That was a moment. That was a moment of important change and a real signaling that a company with their kind of brand was putting real resources into the belief that managing to the constraint of climate was something that was going to position the company well over the long haul, but that the company also had a lot to give by investing heavily, that they would be able to support broader change in carbon capture and, make their IP available so that the kind of system could move forward more quickly, which of course is critically important as well. So are they perfect? I'm sure there's other things we could pull out about Microsoft. I mean, like many tech companies, they don't seem to pay a lot of taxes, but it's a remarkable company which has a profound culture.
It does. And to our listeners, if you've listened to those podcasts, I think they have the highest matching rate of any organization. They provide up to $15,000 to each employee who wants to donate if they'll match it. And they allow them also to donate that money to any not-for-profit of their choice, which truly creates all sorts of roots wherever Microsoft employees are. So very, very profound. Let's talk about, and you mentioned this earlier, that companies now their value is on intangibles, such as trust and reputation, not just the bottom line. I want to go to measurement. Because when we're working with our clients and they're working on integrating their purpose work into the business, and they go, this is about our reputation. We understand that. This may not be a direct impact on sales, but it's about employees and culture and innovation. But then they go, how do we measure this? Mm-hmm. So you are such a voice of wisdom. What are your suggestions?
I'm obsessed. I'm obsessed with this question. I think you're on a really important question as we try to really pick up the pace of change. There's a lot of noise in the market about metrics, and one of the kind of acceptable wisdom is you manage what you measure. I think that's not necessarily true, and that that we ought to somehow be able to develop metrics that enable us to make simple comparisons or direct comparisons between and among firms. I think that's close to preposterous. I mean, think about the complexity of companies and whether or not we could really identify key metrics and make it make us able to say this is a better company than that. Clearly, there's some domains in which that makes sense. I think carbon, and as more companies adopt the kind of net zero stance, we'll be able to see their progress because it's going to be specific to the company and its goals, and there's a rate of change they promised, and we'll be able to see whether or not that's realized or not. Something similar around targets around building diverse boards and executives. That might be something we can make comparisons between and among companies. Companies are different, and we know a lot of CSR executives that have spent an awful lot of time filling out surveys. Do they really move the needle for companies is a question I have. I have this quote on my wall from Jerry Muller, who wrote Tyranny of Metrics, and he said, "Metrics lose their meaning when used to reward or punish performance rather than to diagnose and analyze." That really stopped me. It made me think. I think we need the metrics to help us diagnose and analyze. And I'll offer one example. Morgan Stanley, one of our fellows at Morgan Stanley, Thomas Kamei, was behind this initiative. Morgan Stanley has released a report very, very recently, I think in the last month, on retention. They measure retention by scraping data from LinkedIn, I believe. And what they believe they've been able to ascertain is that retention is a very good proxy for strong culture, and that retention is highly correlated with alpha. So that's interesting because retention is not a flat metric, it's a dynamic metric. It's something that if you know that that's the objective, you know what you might start to tweak in order to improve the outcome. That gets me excited because I feel like it's both transparent to the market. It could have meaning to people that are trying to invest, but it also is something that goes beyond just rewarding or punishing and enables us to kind of get insight into what needs to change from within.
And I know we had TCS, Tata Consultancy, on our show, and they have over 450,000 employees. And we had Balaji Ganapate, who's their global head of CSR. He has 400 people under him. That's really cool.
Yeah.
And they are so amazing with their culture. Now, they're part of Tata. So they've got that, incredible 150 years of, investment in the community. Their retention rates are amazing. They're like 87 to 89% retention.
That's remarkable.
It's remarkable. And when they bring people into the company, they spend 3 months, really onboarding them. And then they do something which is brilliant. And I never forget this. Their first client for a new employee is a not-for-profit. So they are, and they do.
Really?
Oh yeah, it's great. Oh yeah, you'll have to listen to my my podcast with Balaji. And
I'd like to.
Yeah, and they are just, and then of course the work they do in the community is related to software and technology and STEM and things like that. But they are now the #1 information technology company in the world. They've surpassed IBM. They've surpassed Accenture. So, and they're very humble. Just again, they're like Tata. They're very, very humble. But I love Balaji is a good friend. So, it's fun because I make new friends and get to, get back to old friends doing this podcast. I want to talk about the role of CEOs today in activism. You talk about that, which is in the book, which, companies and the leaders who run them are being more and more required to speak out publicly on social issues. And, everything during the Trump era to January 6th, I thought the response after January 6th was very profound about all the PACs pulling back their money, et cetera, et cetera. But what do you think, how we get a lot of questions from either our clients or our clients' friends. What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to go out there and say, we're going to take the hill? Or, my employees want me to, but should I? So I'm sure you have a point of view on that.
Well, I think they are. I think they are to a great degree responding to their employees. And we've seen this time and again, including in the wake of January 6th. It didn't occur to me at first that was what was going on, but it is. Employees are going to be the ones to raise this question. And of course, that means that they're going to be there at the table when these companies say, okay, it's time for us to start putting money back, into the pockets of politicians. It'll be interesting to see how they negotiate this space because it's not like the employees are going to disappear on this. They're going to be more actively involved than they have been before. And so I think finally the question around real disclosure is very much on the plate of business. But, it was a case earlier, you mentioned Trump administration. Early on in the Trump administration, as we remember, one of the things that caught the public very much by surprise was when Trump put in place the ban against issuing visas for 7 Muslim majority countries, and airports blew up all over the country in protests in a weird confluence of cab drivers, and Uber got caught in the crossfire, and it was a real cacophony. And when we stepped back from that, what we saw was executives in the kind of biotech, tech industry leaning in, signing letters saying, you are affecting our business model and you are threatening the standing of employees on which on whom we depend. And that was meaningful. And so that was a case where it was a volatile public issue, it was a volatile political issue, which generally speaking, executives would stay away from. But They leaned in heavy on it because, of course, it was about their business. But we've seen this time and again now. I mean, when, Mark Benioff at Salesforce started speaking out on access to bathrooms in the Carolinas or Indiana, he was speaking for his employees, and we don't want them discriminated against. And is that complicated? You bet it's complicated. When you get, Chip Bergh, when he started weighing in, Chip Bergh of Levi Strauss weighing in on guns. Again, it didn't initially seem like it was about employees, but they had incidents in Levi Strauss stores.
Somebody, brought a gun as they were trying on clothing. Yeah, it's crazy.
Doug McMillon, Walmart, same thing.
Yeah.
So I think it's hard to separate these questions today. Things that used to feel like they were just in the public sphere, in fact, have rebounded to business because of the identification of employees.
So what do you suggest to a company? Let's say we're in a quiet period. We don't have this giant social cacophony happening. But when, how do they prepare? Do they just go along what they should be, their own focus, and then they decide if a January 6th happens, or do they have to respond because January 6th affected almost everybody?
I think the best ones listen deeply. I think we see these examples of, using Walmart as an example. Lee Scott, after, Hurricane Katrina hit, and he had this moment where he was saying, how do we get as good press as we just got as we help, provide the stranded citizens of New Orleans. Sorry, I said Hurricane Sandy. I mean Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah, for sure.
As we serve those who have been stranded and bring water bottles, and they got incredible press because they were the first trucks allowed in after the National Guard lifted the barriers on the roads. It was like the question he was like, how do we get more of this press? And he listened deeply to his own employees, and he was able to hear differently the quest that employees were already on to dematerialize packaging and assure that the fish were sustainably harvested, and et cetera, et cetera. And it was a real pivot for Walmart. And that continues to play out. And Doug McMillon has followed in the footsteps of these kind of shifts in the organization. And Walmart has gone from being a company that people raise questions about to one that we've started to look to for leadership. And so, I think it's breaking out all over. I think it's a time of real change, and it's changed. The role of the CEO has changed. The CEO is leading a community. They're not just leading an enterprise, and they're responsible for an ecosystem and they're responsible to it, and they understand the responsibility that rebounds to them. So it's dynamic and it's changing, but ultimately the CEO's job needs to come back to what the company itself has the power to do. And it's not just about voice, it's about really scrubbing their business model to assure that operations are aligned with intentions. That's the most significant leverage point for the business.
So my next question has to do with lessons learned from COVID. And so, I'd love to hear from you that we're not going back to normal. We're going to be in a new normal, but there were a lot of lessons, albeit painful, that CEOs learned. What were some of the top ones?
Our colleague at the Aspen Institute, Maureen Conway, who leads the Economic Opportunities Program, spoke to our staff recently, and she talked about whether or not this moment, she used the kind of metaphor that we kind of drained the pool, and then we found out what was at the bottom. And I think I've used the term that COVID has humanized enterprises, but I think it's also revealed the humanity of the enterprise to the leadership. They've needed to face kind of conditions that their employees face every day with a different lens, and kind of brought up the reality of what it's like to try to deliver services and when you don't even have the financial security that you need for your family in order to be able to be a trusted employee. And so, I think there's been a real wake-up call there. I don't think the story is fully told. The markets work against it. Let us be clear. We have kind of what we used to call the socially responsible investor, today impact investor, or investors who bring a consciousness to their investing. But the noise in the market is going to punish companies that put people to work, that raise their wages, that improve working conditions, and which, of course, inevitably increases cost. So it's not an easy road, and it requires a real balancing act. And it takes us back to this question of why are we so attuned to the capital markets? Why is that such an influential force? And of course, we've lived through a lot of pressures brought to bear from, to companies that are, one's playing out right now with Danone.
Danone, that was just a heartbreak because Emmanuel Faber, he was just such a leader in terms of what he was trying to do. And first you saw them, take away the titles, and then they axed him out the door because they weren't returning the stock price.
Well, that's, if there's anything that's COVID's revealed is that it's not like companies are getting a free pass on this. There's no harmony between the short-term measure of the stock price and the kinds of investments that we're calling business to make, investments in infrastructure, investments in the health of their community and their enterprise, paying their taxes, right? We will see a real reckoning with taxes this year. These are real costs that companies incur. That does not enhance the stock price. And as much as we might, have this kind of kumbaya idea that somehow companies that perform well, the stock price doesn't show it for a long period of time. I'm a true believer that over the long haul, the company's better off, and so are the shareholders. And we have lots of examples of that. Southwest would be a terrific example of that. So would Microsoft. But, it's not like this is all win-win stuff. It's simply not. And so that's also been revealed in COVID time.
Yikes. So it's you have to be able to balance the short-term, long-term, the innovation and growing sales, and it's not for the faint of heart.
Yeah, it's not for the faint of heart. It takes us back to purpose. You got to be real clear. Why are you in business? Why did the public give you the license to operate? How do you honor that? Larry Fink, and of course we'll see how BlackRock operates as Danone plays out, or we get other Danones, where you have a company that's held in high esteem in the sustainability crowd and has been a real innovator. Will, in fact, the massive investment funds, will they have the back of the company or not? That's the kind of quid pro quo here, and we'll see how that plays out over the long haul.
Do you think as younger millennials and ultimately Gen Z start going into the market that they will be able to put market pressure on companies to perform in a much more holistic and ESG way?
Which market? Consumer market?
Yeah, no, I'm saying investors. And so if you look at, what's going on with Robinhood and trying to, you bring in, tiny bites and pieces of investors. And so just new ages of investors.
No.
Versus institutions.
No, I don't. I am not a big believer that either investors as a class, as if all investors are the same. Of course they're not, right? They come in lots of shapes and sizes and levels of, investment and timeframes. Well, the Robinhood thing is clearly not a long-term play, at least what we've been watching play out with GameStop and all of these things that are actually hard to understand for those of us that think we understand markets. No, I'm not confident that, and I feel the same about consumers. I think investors and consumers engage in magical thinking, that they can have it both ways. And there are actual trade-offs between profits and return and creating high-quality goods and services. It's not cheaper to have high labor standards. It's more expensive to high labor standards. And so what's the trade-off involved? There are companies with superb reputations that have figured this out. I mean, go back to Costco. I mean, they are, it's a low margin business, but they have always elevated employees and have invested in employees and have kept their standards very high, including during COVID, where they gave a pandemic premium, but then didn't pull it back. They stayed at the table with it when many of their competitors stopped. So I think that's the long game. But, consumers were bound to price and convenience. What can I say?
They are bound to price and convenience. Thank you, Amazon. And it will be really interesting to see how Amazon, rises up to its challenges besides, the Bezos, $100 million fund, but also what the company does.
It will indeed. And of course, employees have been part of the action there.
Yeah. unfortunately, we're getting down to the bottom of our conversation because we could go on for days and days.
And
I think that,
well,
we will do that in another, but I want to what haven't you shared? Because you've just got your fountain of wisdom. I love the background that you have, because perhaps you're almost like this, you are magical in your own way, in terms of what your knowledge and how you connect the dots. And you're also very candid about it. But, what else haven't I asked?
Well, I do want to say just a word about this moment that we're in now, where we're seeing maybe for the first time is it very visible. I keep just thinking that the Hollywood version of vaccine development, when we see the movie, is going to show that there was a lot of collaboration, not only between the private sector and the public sector, which is a good story that was the case, or could have been the case, and was, it wasn't a straight ride, but it was an interesting ride, but also between and among private enterprises. I mean, AstraZeneca, the partnerships in Europe, the great example of Merck helping Pfizer get their vaccine out more quickly, because Merck was no longer in the vaccine development game, but they had the capacity to help move forward on production and distribution. This is a story of co-creation in response to a remarkable risk, but of course an incredible opportunity as well. And this dynamic, I think, is going to continue to play out against our biggest global challenges. Climate inequality. You talk about data privacy and species decline. These things all compel the market to operate differently, and you don't solve these problems one organization at a time. We've worked with MasterCard on the data privacy work, and their inclination was, yes, they raised their own standards and became symbolic in that domain, but they knew that to really move forward, they would need to build working relationships between other companies in the financial services domain. So that's the reality in lots of enterprises, and we're seeing some pretty interesting examples of that move forward. So it makes me hopeful. It doesn't mean competition doesn't matter, but maybe we're opening up I love craft beer. And you think about the craft beer industry, they compete fiercely for the best IPA, but they're in learning mode. There is a sense of kind of peers working together to raise the bar overall on the industry at the same time that their brands compete, for best in class.
Oh, that's quite lovely. Actually, I love, because you talk about collaboration, and I totally agree with you. I mean, I agree with you fiercely about employees and about purpose, of course, about culture and collaboration. And there was this wonderful collaboration. I did a speech recently for Sustainable Brands, and I was just looking for a great collaboration. And it was the Southeastern Mobility Coalition that was HBCUs, Goldman Sachs with their 10,000 small businesses. They had 3 foundations. They work with local government, and they all came together. They raised like $250 million for the smallest micro Black-owned businesses, female-owned small businesses, to help bring them back to life.
Wow.
And, would they normally do that? No, I don't think those groups would come together at all. But they did. And so I think collaboration is key, and you got to get over. I was interviewing someone, another podcast, and you have to go from me to we.
Mm.
And so I thought that was really wonderful. So you have given probably about 15 insights, or maybe 20 or 25. But I'd also like to end with, obviously you've got the 6 new rules. And I would say that every listener, don't just read the Cliff's Notes on this book. Read the book. And read the way I read, man. I have a pen. I can't give it to anybody else. And I circle things, and I write notes, and I mark the pages and whatever. Go, oh my God, this is great. Because, I give lots of speeches and try and inspire our clients. But what are the top takeaways that you'd love to just say about the book and about the moment in time in which we live for, business and society?
Well, I think co-creation is one of them. I think the change in the role of the CEO is profound. And I think we've only begun to see what that might mean as a new generation of CEOs move into the C-suite. And and boards, naturally evolve and become more representative of the society from which they're drawing, their strength. And then I am very curious to see what happens with the capital markets piece. The noise is so loud, and yet we have this growing intention of investors. How will that really land? And I guess the last thing I would say is I'm very hopeful that we can at last have an honest conversation about CEO pay. It's not about how much they make, although that's clearly the concern of many. It's more, what are we paying them to do? And as long as total shareholder return is allowed as signal in pay packages, which it clearly is today, we're essentially telling the CEO to work against the grain of the intentions laid out by the Business Roundtable when they redefined, their notion of purpose. So these systems need to harmonize. They can't be working in opposition because, short term will out. And so I'm hopeful that we're creating kind of the resources and the moment where we can have some deeper reflection around the role of corporations and, honor what I believe to be true, which is they're incredibly influential and we can't address our most complex problems without business at the table in a fulsome way.
Fantastic. So, Judy Samuelson, you did not disappoint. You are as fantastic. Your brain is great. You are just articulate, and you are a wonderful guide for all of us to follow. This isn't an easy path, but I always love to end my podcast, and I usually end with the question. I'm going to change it now. I usually end with the question, what is your purpose? But I'm now going to go forward and say, what is the power of your purpose? So thank you, Judy Samuelson, and every single listener, go out and buy 5 copies of this book each, because you have to share it with your teams, because this is an incredible time for business, an incredible time for, cross multi-stakeholder collaborations and such. But you got to understand that this is strategic and it's work. And this is a great guidebook for it. So thank you, Judy Samuelson.
Thank you, Carol.